Good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet. Very turbulent planet at the moment, full of hope and fear, and a lot of action at the local level, even as there's sometimes inaction at the higher levels of government to boost resilience and spread our capacity to deal with both the economic and the direct medical and health impacts of what's unfolded this tumultuous year. I'm Andy Revkin, the Earth Institute of Columbia University. And this is an experiment. It's our fourth month, entering the fourth month of Sustain What, which has now had 55 or so episodes. And they're conversations that are action-oriented. What do we do next? I've tried to facilitate getting people together from different disciplines or different levels of these questions to come out the other end with some action points. And today's session was inspired by a recent article on Medium and a report from Resilient Cities Catalyst from Paul Nelson, who you'll meet in a bigger way in a minute. This is, you can see his work on the screen there. And here's that project. And the title says a huge amount, COVID-19 and the Hidden Urban System Supporting Vulnerable Communities. I've focused increasingly on resilience as a journalist over the decades, whether it's looking at earthquake risk or obviously climate change and pandemic threats like we have now, and information challenges like we have now with the infodemic around this pandemic. And over again, my focus comes toward the community. It's not me telling a better story as a journalist, but it's what can we do to enable community activity and to spread great ideas from that level upward and outward. We're going to start with Paul Nelson, but I want to introduce briefly the others we have here in this wonderful conversation today. Just in the way I see them on camera, which is Jonathan Rose, who's just a few miles away from me in the Hudson Valley, and who's just a fantastic presence on the landscape of community empowering, of resilience thinking, of using mindfulness as a pathway toward impact when you're facing tough challenges. He helped co-founded the Garrison Institute. He wrote a book called The Well-Tempered City, and boy, do we need that book these days. That's and he's involved as a developer too, a longtime developer of equitable mixed income housing and green housing. We have Susan Stamler from hold on, let me just show it here. I had this set up, and of course now I'm screwing up. Hold on one second. Susan Stamler is executive director of United Neighborhood Houses, a policy and social change organization representing 43 neighborhood settlement houses that serve 750,000 New Yorkers. And you'll learn more about what that work is like in a second. And we have, I mentioned Paul Nelson. We have Courtney Coburn, who I've gotten to know recently, a colleague here at Columbia University at the School of Social Work, who's doing fantastic and innovative work using technology to assess and highlight and understand and ultimately change how racism shapes access to health care and so many other challenges we face in that getting an equitable landscape of opportunity and risk reduction. And we're going to start with Paul because, again, it was his report that kind of got us going here today. And that title is, again, COVID-19 illustrates many things, and particularly it illustrates, like no other thing, including climate change and some of the other risks I mentioned, how communities and individuals actually make a huge difference to outcomes. It's not just policy. So Paul, it's great to have you here.
It's great to be here. Thanks so much, Andy. And it's great to be here with you, Courtney, Jonathan, and Susan. There's really sort of a two-pronged genesis for this thought piece, informed, first and foremost by following the early trajectory of COVID and seeing the terrible burden of the pandemic falling disproportionately on our city's most vulnerable residents. And I think observing in the context of this early response that municipal governments, despite the fact that we've been here before with other disasters, we're really struggling to stem the tide of the disease in low-income neighborhoods and within communities of color. And just weeks into the pandemic, COVID was laying bare the structural inequities and impacts of systemic racism, leading to the terrible outcomes among Black Americans and Latinx populations in particular. And that, in my view, and this is kind of the second and related entry point, that cities were once again failing in part because they weren't focusing enough attention on the critical infrastructure that touches on so many residents day in and day out at the neighborhood level. The community-based organizations who provide the suite of human, social, and economic support services in good times and most critically in bad. And this is a lesson that we've learned over and over again through the many shocks and disasters that cities have weathered over the past 40 years, hurricanes, heat waves, among others. And it's also a perspective I gained working at the intersection of municipal government, neighborhoods, and communities for many years. First at New York City government, where I partnered with a network of community development corporations and other groups working to foster vibrant commercial districts in low-income neighborhoods across the 5 boroughs. At a national nonprofit, partnering with workforce development agencies, community colleges, and others on a federally funded Department of Labor, youth empowerment and training program. And then finally, working with cities around the world, first at 100 Resilient Cities, where we had the privilege of partnering with cities of all sizes, facing all kinds of risks and operating in completely diverse governance constructs, and now bringing those lessons, insights, perspectives, and approaches to Resilient Cities Catalyst, where we're partnering not just with cities, but neighborhoods, regions, states as well. And across this work, we've seen that while cities really elevate and pay close attention to critical infrastructure like their transit systems, like their water system, the most critical infrastructure they have connecting them to their most vulnerable residents, this ecosystem of nonprofits and agencies operating at the neighborhood level, is all too often overlooked or ignored. And so I have 5 recommendations for how cities can start to rectify that oversight. But first, I think to understand the complexity, you need to start at the resident experience. And I mean, if you zoom in on the neighborhood level and consider the day-to-day experience of its residents, you know that people often interface and experience government not through municipal agencies, but really through trusted nonprofit groups and local intermediaries. And these are the human service providers, the community development organizations, the faith-based support groups that advocate for the needs of residents, provide them with housing, medical care, training, and on a day-to-day basis, really foster a sense of community among neighbors, a sense of place, and a critical trust. And during crises like COVID, the relationships between these neighborhood-based organizations and residents, I think, become real lifelines that provide them with access to, critical services, essential information, and a link to city-led response and recovery efforts. And that's not to say that government doesn't interact with residents on a day-to-day basis, right? Public schools are just one example, but all too often, cities lack a unified view, appreciation, and understanding of the entire complex web of social service agencies and nonprofits that work in their vulnerable communities. And as a result, they can't effectively or efficiently partner with them in times of crisis. And I really
how does that? What's been the gap? Why isn't that something that is just there that you just already know? Like, especially in the internet age.
I mean, I think it's hard because government silos really make this worse, right? I mean, city and county departments are organized around discrete systems, right? Health, mobility, education, rather than on the places they serve. And neighborhoods where all those systems intersect in the lives of city residents. And even within those agencies, the relationships that are built are often a function of funding streams or contracts that sort of don't have the incentives in place to ensure sort of silo-busting collaboration. And so the result is kind of this fragmented system where the critical connective tissue really running among residents to CBOs and among county government agencies is really too diffuse to be easily activated.
So let me bring Susan Stamler in here, because she's in one of those institutions, and I'd love to get her angle on what are the barriers between what has been done with the settlement houses and how that relates to communicating with each other, among other things. I guess she's got a network of those, and then with government too.
Thank you. It's great to be here, and what a time it is to be looking at our communities. Yeah. Settlement houses actually have been in their communities, many since the late 19th century, with the purpose of lifting and strengthening their neighborhoods. And that was before a flood of government dollars, but it was to make sure that the people who lived in the neighborhoods were able to connect to something outside of themselves. So they saw a settlement house as a place to come for not only service, but also for communal life, for arts and other opportunities, civic life as well. And so here we are today, and we represent a network of 43 settlement houses. And in the middle of a pandemic, we're finding exactly as Paul mentioned, we have government who not only sees itself in its silos, but sees its nonprofit human service providers almost as vendors. And until that relationship changes, until there's a true partnership in actually providing for the community needs based on what the community needs and not necessarily how a procurement is written, we should have an emergency valve right now that allows government to flip a switch, and instead of certain contracts having no money to pay staff and lay people off, and other contracts, as we're approaching the end of a fiscal year, having funds left over and deciding that they're going to buy more computers, this should be a time where you look to your community leaders. These people who are running settlement houses are running multi-million-dollar ventures, balancing a lot of regulatory issues, community issues, government issues. These are the people who are embedded in their neighborhoods. Unfortunately, they're looked at as a vendor. And so we need to change that relationship, because I think at the end of the day, it would only strengthen our communities.
You know, I one of the early shows I did here, I guess I can call it a show, was with a community network in Bhopal, India, where they had a bit of a relationship with the city government through, they were basically middle-class folks who were working on a plastics reduction campaign, right? Completely unrelated to what we're talking about. Then came the lockdown, and they kind of morphed into a food network almost overnight, using WhatsApp to identify families, the poorest families, you know, below $1 a day, who couldn't even get out to get food, or you know, can't even have clean water to wash their hands with. And they sort of became a sensory apparatus. So they had an adaptive ability. They did have a relationship with government that maybe it's actually more plastic than what, more malleable, adaptive than what I'm hearing. It sounds like New York has. Does that feel like something that could happen here? That could have happened here? That sort of, hey, let's do this and just do it, or is this part of the problem?
You know, I don't think it's absolutist. I think that there are opportunities, and both New York City government and its partners and communities have taken those opportunities. But I have to say it's been a little bumpy. I must say also that there have been corporate partners that have stepped in. And for example, City has reached out to us. They kept their corporate kitchen open, and they were able to provide 40,000 meals through the settlement houses that they delivered to. So we were able to make sure it got to the right communities who needed it. And so, you know, I do think it's possible. I know that it's not always a smooth operation. When New York City had to stand up a couple of programs quickly, they did look to the nonprofit sector to help to provide those workers and the workforce to do so. But you would think after 9/11 and after Hurricane Sandy, and now this, and no one incident is connected to the other than something went terribly wrong, and we can't wait for government to come in and fix it. We have to look to the strength of the community providers to be there.
That's so interesting. So maybe Jonathan, next on that. So you're in kind of the public sector, private sector interface too, and I'm sure you deal on the development side with all the regulatory burdens, and then thinking about how that interlaces with empowering communities. Thinking about Paul's report, what comes to mind?
So much. By the way, I just want to note that I started my career as a volunteer and then board member of the Education Alliance, which is one of Susan's settlement houses, one of the oldest settlement houses, and in the 1970s, and we really steeped ourselves in bringing an extraordinary range of services to a community that was underserved, and being the integrator in a government that itself was not the integrator. So we had after-school programs and daycare programs and feeding programs for low-income seniors and drugs treatment programs and runaway youth programs and all those things that we pulled together, but there was no government agency that had a vision of pulling all those together. I hope this doesn't step on what Courtney is going to say, but we know now there's something called the social determinants of health, and that 80% of our health does not come from prescription medicine and our doctor's appointments, but actually comes from larger social systems that support us. And speaking of resilience, we really saw that in 1997, Eric Kleinenberg did an interesting study in the heat wave of Chicago, where about 800 people died because of the heat wave. And he mapped to where they died, and most of the best recovery rates were in the wealthy, whiter areas, but there were a couple of African-American neighborhoods that outperformed the white neighborhoods and the wealthy neighborhoods in terms of resilience. And it's because they had these very extensive social networks of care and networks of care.
Right.
So I'd like to take this in 2 points. So number one is Paul's report is so useful because it really maps out how essential this infrastructure of care is and of social services. So we as developers are trying to build affordable housing that in partnership with these services lifts our residents out of, improves their health and lifts their opportunity potential. And we can only do that by partnering with after-school programs and library programs and health programs, health services programs. And our typical property will partner with 20 to 30 programs in that ecosystem. So number one, having the ecosystem mapped and made clear and understanding how one integrates it, if it had more integrative functions, and that's what all true and nature ecosystems do, that would be better. And there, by the way, there's an app called Aunt Bertha that can help do that. So we're beginning to see some technology with that. The second, interesting thing, is that where we've seen the greatest, so our company owns properties all across, in many places around America. And where we saw the most innovation was in the places with the least community support services. So there is in the Midwest, we have a bunch of low-income senior housing projects in smaller towns in Ohio and Michigan that don't have as vibrant and extensive a social network system that you've described. And we saw a tremendous arising of volunteerism to come and feed our residents, to provide services, in all kinds of ways that spontaneously arose. There's an interesting book about it by Rebecca Solnit called A Paradise Built in Hell that describes how that sometimes spontaneously happens.
So let's bring Courtney back in. She was just rearranging the technology there. And I think you can hear us. We see you very well.
Yes, I can hear you.
How are you doing?
I'm fine.
Before you start, I want to show folks, people a little bit of a visual of what you're working on, among many other things. This you won't see the sound, so you could describe this actually. This was a TED, one of the TED family of talks you gave, and you'll see in a second about bridging a gap in understanding between those of us who have had more time in power, white privilege is a real thing, and then how we figure out how to make societies that are more equitable. You'll see it here in a second.
Yeah.
Whoops, I just had this set up. Where is it? Here we go. So Courtney, can you describe what we're looking at there?
Yeah, so I think, part of my work has been motivated by helping people move beyond using the language of racism and integrating an anti-racist practice into what they do, how they analyze problems and how they attempt to solve those problems. So what I found is that especially the do-gooders among us, right, will name racism, but we haven't really figured out what to do about it other than name it. And so my hope is to use virtual reality to help people, I think, engage more deeply with these sorts of issues and really understand what's at stake for what we're talking about here when we're thinking about racism. And again, not racism, and this group is clearly sort of naming social determinants of health and thinking about structures and systems that impact a variety of outcomes. But often in our public discourse, when we talk about racism, we tend to think about it as an individual occurrence, something that happens between individuals or some bias that lives in our unconscious selves, as opposed to the ways in which we've structured policy, the ways in which we've built neighborhoods and determined where boundaries lie and where we've determined which resources go here versus there. Too often we don't collectively think about that as racist acts in policy as well. Racist being you have systematically disadvantaged a group of people regardless of your intention. So we're using virtual reality to put you in the shoes of a Black male as a child, adolescent, and adult who's experiencing racism in different forms across different contexts, to try and get a sense, not only does it shift empathy, but does it help people engage in a more meaningful and complex way with systems of racism. And just quickly, I'll add that we're working on a new piece that's more directly trying to grapple with what we call structural competence. So do you understand how systems work, right, to create disadvantage, particularly by race? And we're integrating data visualization into virtual reality. So you're this character, you can move the body around, it's interactive, you can interact with things and people on the scene, and people can interact with you in the experience. And what we're playing with now is that you'll be able to go back into a scene, say a street in Brooklyn, in this virtual environment, and start to play around with the context, to be able to manipulate time, to drag it forwards and backwards, and see how a policy decision physically changes the virtual environment around you. So when we do that, do you start to understand how a housing policy might have implications for employment and policing and education? Do you understand how a stop and frisk practice is not just something that's inconvenient to some, but actually something that has implications for the physical environment and the health of those who are stopped? Can we visualize structural racism for you, so that you really start to understand how these systems, as you all have been indicating, how these systems intersect to create the patterns by race that we observe. And the last point I'll make is even around the language of vulnerability. That language can connote that the problem exists within the communities themselves and that they need to be helped, as opposed to we owe a debt to those we have oppressed and disadvantaged over time. What language should we use then? It's not a service or a helping hand or a charity, it's righting wrongs. And shifting our language and framing in that direction is also critical.
Oh boy, you brought up so many exciting points that seem to intersect with Paul's work very well. Like if you took his report.
Hear you, Andy.
Oh, sorry, I muted. Hold on. You can't hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, can you hear me okay, Courtney? But let me keep going, and then we'll see if Courtney can come back on. At Arizona State University, for example, over the last 15 years, they've developed what they call a decision theater, which is sort of a lab for giving decision makers scenario-based approaches to resolving some of these structural problems of this kind. Then you look at your report, and it's all about the ecosystem of decision making and identifying these gaps between vital parts of what makes a city resilient. And that interfaces, of course, with what Susan and Jonathan were talking about. There's also very old things like, you remember Second City and Sims, and there's a lot of capacity to use tools to do scenario building, it seems, around here. And actually that could interface even in the education space as well. I don't know, Jonathan or Susan, if you've seen efforts along those lines so far. I mean, are people starting to sort of game out, and Paul, obviously, starting to game out how you would, it's like destructure. It's like destructuring. It's like building landscape of access and the like, but not necessarily making it bureaucratic, sort of taking away that. What are the tools that could make this more doable, if there are there? Maybe Paul first, because it's your report.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, and seeing a tool so powerful as the scenarios and what Courtney has developed, I mean, it really is about what are the tactical approaches that policymakers, decision makers, communities, and community-based organizations can collectively leverage to be designing and delivering policies that don't just speak to anti-racism, but actually deliver that in a way that counteracts the long-term impacts that will come from that. So I think I think there's a power in sort of bringing approaches like human-centered design and others to communities to ensure that residents and community-based organizations are driving the sort of policies and programs that are being developed and really playing a governance role in ensuring their delivery. From just sort of a practical policy level, I mean, I think about sort of an equity check that was developed by a collaborator that we've worked with, Andrea Batista Schlesinger, who's a partner at HRNA, really taking a close, hard look at, as cities make policies and make decisions around programs and policies, thinking first and foremost, like, who's affected by this initiative and how? Who are the winners and losers in this? And secondly, who's participating in the making of this initiative? Who's at the table as we're crafting solutions, in partnership with community? And then finally, as we think about actual delivery, and this is where I think something like Courtney's tools could be so incredibly powerful, is what might impact the equitable implementation of this initiative, right? We could design with community and with community-based organizations an incredible program to mitigate the impacts of systemic racism, and in its delivery that could all fall apart. So I think that's where it's the systems level and individual bias that has to be explored through different approaches, frameworks, and tools. And cities, I think, and communities are really seeking for practical, actionable tools to make those changes.
And actually, that brings up Jonathan, a point Jonathan was hoping to make too. Jonathan, you unmute. That's great. About the digital divide. We had recently on here a session where that uneven landscape of access to information and technology is a huge thing as well.
So we've long talked about the digital divide, but the COVID pandemic really brought it to the fore, because there are a whole bunch of people, including us, who are able to work from home, and some people are working really, really well from home. And we saw that there is therefore a divide in jobs and I'm going to say that I'm going to put in 3 big buckets of jobs. So there's the jobs that one could continue to do from home. There are the jobs that one had to show up for. So being an orderly in a hospital, or a doctor or nurse, or a police person or fire person, or somebody who takes out the garbage. Those people had to show up and experience greater levels of risk, while those on the other side of the digital divide. And then the third category are those who lost their work because they worked in a restaurant, or they worked in something that was simply closed down. And what we learned is that so in the last recession, one of the unfortunate consequences is that the way the economy was structured and the power structures that sought their support coming out of it meant that inequality increased rather than decreased coming out of the last recession. What I believe we're going to see coming out of this recession is, in this event, is that those on this side of the digital divide, again, will be dramatically increased, empowered, and strengthened, and those on the other side of the digital divide won't be. So the question then really is, how do you create, and what we've also learned is that so one of the solutions to this networking and community, creating equality of information flow and having people be able to map patterns of social support and how can you tie it all together, is that feels like a natural digital exercise, but only for those who can be on the right side of the digital divide. And that requires, number one, money and credit, because to have an account with whoever provides your digital services requires credit, and typically a bank account, and many of our low-income residents are not banked. And it requires a computer, and it actually requires several, because if parents are using one and you have children at home who need to be schooled, there's others. And it requires software and training, and it's a whole series of things that we as a society have to focus on. So I'm just going to pick up one other point, that when Courtney mentioned the structures of racism, each one of them tilted and biased the landscape of opportunity away from Black people and towards white people, and away sometimes from immigrants, etc. But it has distorted the landscape of opportunity. The only pathway to a just and sustainable society is that we equalize the landscape of opportunity for all. And to do that, we need to both see where it's distorted and then figure out how to solve this. So on the digital divide, I think there's a lot more to be seen about it's not just about whether a community has the high-speed internet access pipes to it. That's certainly important, but there are many other elements.
So Courtney, what do you think? I've been so happy to build bridges with the School of Social Work from the Earth Institute. You're just starting. These issues transcend COVID-19, of course. Climate vulnerability. We just heard about heat waves, another one of which we're in right now. What's the to-do list look like here? If you were to partner with someone here or others, or how do we expand this conversation, either in terms of scholarship or actually testing things? What comes to mind?
I think a big piece of from a perspective of social work, and certainly from my perspective, is two issues. One, framing. How do we frame these problems? So again, not just around the language, but how do we think these problems came to be? How do we imagine that these problems are currently existing? And that is critical to determining what we do next, as Jonathan was saying. You have to see the landscape in order to figure out what levers to pull. And in addition to that framing, there's an ideological orientation toward those problems, toward equity. Do you believe that we should live in a society that is equitable? And if you truly believe that, then what actions actually lead us to equity? And again, I've been in a space, and this includes social work. This is not just sort of like, holier than thou sort of position, but too often we espouse the language of equity and we don't do the things that we know will lead us to actual equity. That's too hard. We can't do that. We couldn't possibly upset this group by trying to help this group more. And we make all sorts of choices that actually prevent us from getting to equity. And the third piece is a lot of people across multiple disciplines have spent a lot of time not only trying to describe what the problems are, they've spent a lot of time trying to figure out which levers to pull. And often we're not sharing that information across disciplines, across institutions. And so I think creating a process by which we can knowledge share. What do political scientists and public health scholars and social workers have to say about housing equity? What would they do? Because we know a lot already. We just don't always have access to that knowledge and information. So I think those are critical components to this. And equity requires that the groups that are worse off, and with the framing of why are they worse off, have to have more. They need different things. We can't just sort of spread out the same things. With some caveats, because there are some solutions like the economics research around baby bonds, for instance, where every family, regardless of income, gets the same amount of support through the bond. Helps us get closer to racial equity. So there are some exceptions where this group doesn't need something different. Even if you give it to everyone, like universal health care, everyone benefits from that. So, but again, we study this, not me personally, but there are lots of people who have pieced some of this together. We just have to be willing to take some risk and pull the levers and unfortunately make some people mad as we do that.
Well, yeah, I want to ask Paul to come back too in the context of 100 Resilient Cities, which was a very brave experiment and is living on in different ways. So much of the learning here, as I mentioned in mentioning Bhopal earlier, it feels like there can be co-production of knowledge and experimentation by looking across wider landscapes of cities, whether in the States or not. Even thinking about sectors, cities that are flood vulnerable, cities that are hot. Hyderabad and Phoenix are almost the same climate, so that, and you don't want to go too wide, right? Because then it gets so fuzzy. But the lessons that you guys learned about breaking barriers seems very important here still, even at this level of a particular city and its nonprofit infrastructure. Was there any specific points that came out of that feel germane?
Definitely. I mean, I think one thing that we learned across our really privileged partnership with so many cities was that the way cities, interface and talk to and speak to their residents is broken in many ways. I mean, all cities, regardless of their context, struggle with that. And the sort of traditional stakeholder and engagement methods that municipalities employ through their traditional levers don't meet the needs and challenges of the 21st century. And I think regardless of the governance context, cities, although there are differentiations, of course, across regions, have a lot of power to drive new solutions through procurement and through how they sort of make decisions around where they direct their resources. And so bringing some of these considerations, these systemic changes into the regular functioning of government, whether that's, bringing equity lenses to procurement decisions, right? Bringing, in terms of how resources are allocated across neighborhoods and how decisions get made around which neighborhoods, due to the structural and long-standing inequities that have, led to worse and worse outcomes among residents. How can cities be redirecting resources in ways that really can sort of start to course correct around that? And I think the other thing, and this again depends on the context, but the power of the sort of convening power of a city leader to make statements around what's important and coalescing around a vision for a tomorrow that demands an equitable and resilient future. I think about the mayor of Boston, Mayor Walsh, who through their resilience work, which was led first by Chief Resilience Officer Tia Martin and now by incredible Lori Nelson, fostering Boston conversations around race beginning in 2016, recognizing that to chart a resilient future, you can't not deal with the impacts and systemic racism that have befallen the city or a city at all. And so I think, cities need to look at their entire toolkit, both the bully pulpit, the levers that they have there, and that's common across all of the cities where we've had the pleasure and privilege of working.
So Susan, again, swinging back to a practitioner or sort of a network of practitioners, what comes to mind from your end here? I'll frame the question this way. Is the COVID-19 pandemic is generating two stresses. One is to build back. In other words, let's just get back to work. Let's do the back means backward, right? Restore is past tense. And then pro-generative work, like how do we actually break these old barriers? Do you fear or feel excited about, are we tipping more toward the pro-generative? Or are we threatened now with just being so eager to kind of get back to business that we're going to get stuck? And Courtney, I'm sure you think about this too in the context of race. We've had this upheaval, but then what? So Susan, what comes to mind there? Where should my needle be?
So, it's interesting right after, it's hard to pinpoint the beginning, but in the very beginning part of the epidemic, we saw the government say that people needed critical things. Number one is that we needed childcare so that our essential workers could get to work. Childcare is something we've been talking about for hundreds of years, really. The need to be able to support families in a way so that parents can work. The other thing that people needed is they needed to make sure that they were safe. And so we were banning evictions. And then the last thing that people needed was food. And so emergency food distribution got set up very fast. And so how interesting the issues that we've been talking about forever, that we're constantly battling for more funding around childcare, keeping people safe in homes and preventing homelessness, and making sure that people have food. And we know that there are tremendous numbers of food insecure people even before this epidemic. That actually became the big thing that had to be figured out, discussed, and decided. So I actually remain hopeful that we're going to continue to have conversations of what communities need, actually all communities need, whether you have money or not, resources or not. We need as a city to make sure that people have access to these critical services. And lastly, I just want to say, one of the issues that we deal with in government is how we measure the lines of community and what does community mean. So if we want to make sure we have equitable distribution of resources, we have to agree on a set of common boundaries. And what are those boundaries? Well, they could be community boards. They could be the districts that the sanitation and police and other uniformed services work in. It could be the Department of Education and all of their boundaries. But when we're looking to make holistic decisions for the city, the first thing we better do is agree on what are the boundaries we're looking at and how do we determine whether there is an equitable distribution of resources.
So interesting. I'm bringing on something here I want to add to this conversation. Courtney had to pop off for a second for a technical issue. And this is the role of science in academia. I've gotten to know a very young organization called Science for New York. That's essentially a network of mostly young scientists who want to figure out how to be useful. And Courtney, who's coming back on in a minute, knows that everyone at Columbia, I know, wants to be useful as well as generating new knowledge and getting tenure, especially at a time like now. And especially, being in the School of Social Work too, you're in a position where you're much more, I would assume the culture there is much more about getting stuff done in the actual world, perhaps than in the school of, the true deep scholarship parts of.
We're still being tenured by Columbia, though. So if
say that again,
we're still being tenured by Columbia, though. So we still have to.
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
So the journalism professors I know feel the same way sometimes.
Yeah, exactly.
So what can we do? I don't know, Courtney, you had to come back on in the middle, but I posted here Science for New York, which is an organization it's trying to get scientists to, and I would say not just scientists, but scholars, to figure out how to plug in more actionably in the needs of communities. And they have a map of, so scientists can actually go to their community board meeting. They encourage them just to go to a community board meeting and to understand that ecosystem Paul was talking about. You can't really understand that until you actually see it, how the changes get made. And I feel like there's a lot more that can be done there. I know in our climate school that where Columbia is trying to pursue, there's a lot of verbal commitment to taking down some of those walls too. But when you think about this in that context, could we do, what are the things we could do like tomorrow or next week or later this year in academia that could make a difference?
One, I think making access to research more accessible, right? You have all of these paywalls. We've produced all of this knowledge. They're in journals, articles that, cost thousands of dollars to access if you're not part of an academic institution. How could a practitioner possibly access that type of information that's been produced? Creating more of a relationship between those who do practice and create policy and those who are conducting research, creating opportunities for more exchange and dialogue so that we understand the priorities of those creating policy, what's coming down the pike, people who are in practice and what they know and understand. They're just as knowledgeable as people who are conducting scholarship in academic spaces. And so I think those are two. And we're combating a culture of objectivity. There's this assumption that we have to create some distance between ourselves and the real world as scientists so that we can remain objective and just conduct basic research. And I think there's incredible value. I don't think that's realistic, but I think there's value in holding that ideal at least. There's also value in people who are deliberately working to translate their work into practice. And our institutions, our academic institutions have to shift to not only valuing that in the form of lip service, but how do you tenure someone? How do you promote someone? How do you evaluate the work of someone who's seeking to apply their scholarship in the real world? And it's an ongoing struggle that requires, again, cultural and structural shifts, and that we're not quite there yet. And certainly Columbia, Lee Bollinger has been talking about the fourth purpose, thinking about ways that the academy needs to have impact in the real world, and what are the processes by which we evaluate that type of scholarship. So there are some shifts happening that are important. And I think too, Susan talked about this earlier, and others sort of touched on this, also valuing the expertise that already exists in communities. They are their own experts on their own lives and know a lot about what we need to do. It doesn't necessarily require an empirical model for us to understand. And if we just went and talked to someone who lived in these communities, they could tell us a lot about their lives and which levers we needed to pull. So I think valuing different types of knowledge, encouraging access to scientific knowledge that's been produced in academic journals that aren't easily accessible outside of academic spaces, and creating a flow of information that goes both ways between practice, policy, communities, and the academy.
So Jonathan and Susan, I want to get back to you on this community empowerment and what communities can do with their own communication capacity. Maybe there's something we can do to help facilitate some of that. Like on the heat island effect, or you've seen maps that show that pollution, small particle pollution maps with race, even more than poverty nationally. So empowering communities to collect their own data in public housing or in settlement housing, or is there much of that going on yet? My wife works in education unit that teaches teachers how to use small particle air pollution monitors, and kids can do this stuff too. Is that part of this too, and this gestalt that could happen?
I'll jump in. It could happen, and you mentioned one of the most important communities in New York, which is public housing. It's the last bastion of affordable housing, actually, that exists in New York City. And essentially, communities in public housing are often starved of the very real things that communities need to thrive: access to supermarkets, access to banks, quality green space, and other supports in neighborhoods. And so one relatively easy thing to do would be to look at public housing and not only do the necessary repairs so that people have heat and hot water and we're providing the housing and dignified housing that people deserve to live in, but look at public housing as a community and what keeps them strong. And so we're always advocating and lobbying for pots of money to go into public housing communities because there's community space there. So how do we build an infrastructure of community support where a community actually is? That really should be a no-brainer and a pretty easy thing to look at a map and figure out what's there and what's not there. So first, making sure we have housing stock that is appropriate for people to actually live in. And secondly is to look at the kinds of supports that all communities need to thrive, whether it's childcare or support for older adults who might not be able to leave their homes. So I think it's possible. I think it would take a big effort to get us there.
So I guess I could take us back to that question I asked earlier. Are we under so much pressure to build back, to be fast, are we in danger of losing that systemic forward-looking aspect, Jonathan?
So I think it's not that we're in danger. It's not that we are seeking to look back. I think there's huge interest in looking forward, but we don't have the capacities to do so, and we don't have the vision. So if you just say that there on the table today are issues of racism, inequality, access to healthcare, equality of healthcare, and the environmental issues, we know they're all deeply interconnected. We know that we need systemic solutions for those. But because, frankly, for the last 3 years, we've been fighting a game just to try and preserve what we have, we haven't really, I don't think there's been sufficient visioning of how to go forward. But I just want to speak a little bit about your last question. So our company uses a methodology called asset-based community development, which is based on listening to the residents, and then a process called co-creation, where all the programs that we work are, we co-create with our residents. And there's some magnificent and beautiful work that comes out of this, but it completely is not at a scale in which it can address the structural issues that we referred to earlier. And so again, Andy, you mentioned like having communities do particle sampling and all that stuff, which is great. It's great information, but those communities shouldn't have to. In fact, the health structures should say that everybody has a right to healthy and clean air and water, every bit of the environment, and it is our job to protect people. So these things they're useful responses to a dysfunctional system, but we need to figure out how to get the systems functional so that we're really unleashing people's greatest capacities rather than their survival capacities.
Yeah, although I might, debate is not the right word. I might
offer,
I'll offer a different perspective on that community data as an empowering tool, because then if you have an ecosystem where the community presents that at their community board meeting, they're no longer locked out of the decision process, there becomes a landscape. You can point to a map and say, wow, look at that, black neighborhoods, blah, blah, blah. And that can become a rallying cry to take what's happening right now with Black Lives Matter and saying, Black Lives Matter here, and look what's happening. I don't know if that feels like
So here was my point. My point is about the looking back, looking forward.
Yeah.
So imagine if the structural systems were not so biased and so distorted. Then the community-based mapping and work could be unleashed to the vision carrying us forward versus the repairing of what's wrong now.
For sure. Well, we have a few more minutes. I'd love for each of you to sort of have the floor for a couple of minutes to present a notion of a next step. Jeremy Zalar, who used to work with me at the New York Times, he helped build .earth, my blog there. He worked in government, digital.gov, making all the government websites more useful to taxpayers who are paying for government. And he has this 5% rule. He says, like, what can you do tomorrow? What you personally, not we, not using the word we, but I know what I can do. I can do more of these sessions on this particular point and get more actionable tracks here. But if each of you had a sense of something you can do next week or in your next grant proposal or your next, what would that look like? Maybe we'll start with Paul. Again, we kind of built this discussion initially around your thesis.
Absolutely. I mean, I think to the point around how do we start, and will we be able to really create the space for systems change and our urgency to respond? I think what's unique about not unique, but what's exciting about potential pathways for a systemic recovery is neighborhoods represent a scale at which you can really start thinking about all of these systems that come together. And so if we can leverage the urgency created around this disproportionate impact that certain communities are facing and bring together the communities, the nonprofit organizations, and the agencies at work to create a vision at the neighborhood level for what a resilient and equitable recovery from COVID would look like. And what would it mean to be designing that at the neighborhood level and coalescing the resources around that to scale different models. There's not one model that's going to work for every community, but the lessons that could be generated there could be then, built up to the city and fostered in other places. And there's a really, I think, amazing opportunity, and this could be my next step is pulling together a grant proposal around this, would be to foster those lessons learned either within a city, because I think to Courtney's point, the 21st century challenges that we're facing, no one sector can go it alone. And so we need to be creating the spaces and the learning communities where policymakers, practitioners, residents are there as experts contributing to the solutions that will impact their lives. And so I think working at the neighborhood scale and starting with the neighborhoods that have been most impacted by the COVID pandemic and so many other structural inequities we've been talking about today could be a great first step.
Susan, from the housing, the settlement houses vantage point of 700,000 city residents scrambling to try to cut the impacts of the next one of these and get through this moment as well, what comes to mind as next?
A number of our really essential programs live on the margins of government budgets and that they're not mandated services. And so when there's a hiccup, a blip, a crash, or something happens in the economy, the ripple effect is felt typically in cutting after school programs or reducing services in communities. And so what I would like to see is to create a platform where these services, like delivering your mail and paved roads, it's really critical to have an array of services that all people need. Some people buy them and some people need them at reduced or free costs. And so the way that you empower a community is by making sure that they have access to these array of services. And then just lastly, I just want to make sure that people would have an easier time voting, because
minor detail.
Just lived through a primary in New York State that was fraught with lots of questions and issues. I think people are finding their voice, and I'm going to be hopeful. And I think people want to express their voice in a whole lot of different ways. And it could be in the streets, it could be filling out your census, and it could be voting.
And Courtney, what's your next step? What can you and I do together, perhaps, next?
I'm still experiencing a video delay, but can you hear me okay?
We can hear you, yes.
Great. I think what I would love to do, going back to an earlier point, is I feel like we're in this moment where I'm so tired of putting Band-Aids on old systems that were designed to create the very inequities that we're talking about. And I would love to be in a space where we get to reimagine society and use this moment that we're in, where the world has been turned upside down, to really push for something new. And I've always had this dream of creating a sort of Justice League, the best and the brightest of people who are studying things from all sorts of different angles, with all sorts of different skill sets, coming together to really piece together these pieces of knowledge that we have, that we know, we understand, we know what levers to pull, and start creating a solutions map, right? So that we're acting in congruence with each other, with an understanding of how these different systems function, so that we're not working in isolation. So, and if you want to put together a Justice League, I'll happily join.
Oh, I love the idea. No, we'll convene a session on that.
Justice League, that works better.
No, we'll convene a session on that, at least one. I see each time I've done one of these, they end up feeling like a track. Like I'm doing one on vaccination confidence, doing one on other aspects of community resilience. There's so much more to do here. I'm sorry about your technical issues, but you came through great. The audio was fine. Michael Crow, absolutely. I'll put on the Justice League at ASU. Decision Theater, his focus on empowering education for everyone, including online. We'll talk about that. Great. So Jonathan.
So I'm going to do something really simple that goes back to the beginning premise of really in Paul's article. So when we can add one resident service coordinator, this is a social worker who works with our residents, hears their needs, and then connects them to food and health and social services and education programs, et cetera. It's just a facilitator and integrates, a human integrator. And HUD recommends that there be one for every 90 residents. When we can build that into our budgets, the transformation in our residents' lives is tremendous. And it's a very simple way it's a super cost-effective way to jump us over a lot of the issues, not to change the structural issues, but to at least help our residents move forward. And because affordable housing is so expensive, needs such deep subsidies, there's a continual debate, which is, do you build more and just get it as cheap as possible and as much as possible because so much is needed? Or because if you were to fund a resident service coordinator in every affordable housing project, the residents living in it would do much better, but you wouldn't build as much. And that's a debate. And I just wish we could build as much affordable housing as possible and provide resident services with each one.
That sounds a lot like something Susan had mentioned too. And that idea of those key people, key providers, among other things, just the fact that it connects with the social work arena of Courtney feels like there's much more to discuss here. And I'm going to show you a slide that before we close out, I spent time in India a couple of years ago working on a story on biomass cooking and pollution and the huge cost in women's lives. And in India has this amazing network of 1 million rural social health activists, they're called ASHA, who are connected by WhatsApp with local medical establishments. And they provide this incredible sensory apparatus that at the village level can create resilience. And their main job is knowing who's getting pregnant and getting them early prenatal care. So these models are universal. And the more I can foster some of that crosstalk, the better. This has been a great discussion. I really appreciate your time, everyone. On Friday is the next one of these. This is, again, several times a week now. Mondays are practical how to thrive online sessions. Wednesdays are policy like this one. And Fridays are media analysis. And this Friday it will be on actually on marginalized populations. How do you cover COVID-19 as a journalist with shrinking resources in places that are most at risk? And this is it for this session of Sustain What? Sustain What is a global online conversation identifying solutions to the complicated, shape-shifting, and epic challenges of humanity's great acceleration. and of course now a great pause, as some call it. A prime focus is making sense of and getting the most out of the planet's fast-forward information environment. It's the only Earth system changing faster than the actual environment. This webcast is produced as part of my work building Columbia University's new Earth Institute initiative on communication and sustainability. I hope if you've been watching, you'll share this with others. It becomes an archive video right away. And thanks so much to my guests today for being with us, and hopefully you'll be back. I think we should have this session again in a few months and see how we're doing. So thank you, guys.